the next panel discussion, the hope for the future, what should outlast the war. And the topic of this presentation is basically, if we have this much heritage and historical buildings ruined in many cities all over Ukraine, how will we decide what should prevail, what should we keep and what should be restored, and at what point we will have to decide to demolish the heritage. In order to find this place of the heritage in the future recovery, we invited the speakers from various spheres who can comment from their own point of view, and I want to present Valery Pekar. He is a lecturer of Kyiv-Mohyla Business School and Lviv Business School of Ukrainian Catholic University. Taras Yeleiko, who is sitting here with me, the director of Invest Office and expert in investment, financial management and asset management of the public and private sectors. We will also hear Alexandra Kovalchuk, the acting director of the Odessa Fine Arts Museum. She will speak with us from USA. Philip Deytachmar, the head of programs at the European Cultural Foundation, which supported greatly the Museum of Ukrainian Victory, our project, and the collection of data, training of reporters who collect photogrammetry. And we will also be really honored to hear from Sarah Abram. She is the Secretary General of important conservation institution in Italy, CCR La Venaria Reale, and from the scientific point of view, we will be able to hear their expertise in the restoration sphere. So we will start with Valery Pekar. I would ask you, Valery, to present online in Zoom the place of heritage in this strategy of recovery for 2030, which was presented not so long ago in the in this forum in Europe. And if you can start, just switch on Zoom microphone and camera.
Which I think could be relevant. Three major things which I would like to share with you, ladies and gentlemen, are, first of all, Ukraine is unique, having no gap between tradition and modernity. In many cultures over the world, we have a gap, we have a certain controversy between tradition and modernity. Since Ukraine has a rather retarded, I can say, late national development, we have absolutely different approach. Here in Ukraine, tradition is the modernity. And modernity for us includes going back to centuries for tradition, looking for tradition. That is why our modern aesthetics is our traditional aesthetics, which is not usual over the world. And that is why we are building our modernity on our historical memory. This is because of late development and because of statelessness for centuries and centuries. And that is why traditional optics, looking into tradition as something different from modernity, which is true for many nations, is not true here in Ukraine. Second, Ukraine has not non-finished decolonization. Indeed, Ukraine got its independence in 1991, but was dependent from the empire in many senses, both political, economic, cultural, mental, let's say. So that means that we should rebuild, reconstruct our historical memory, and this is a very important part of our reconstruction. So we reconstruct not only buildings shot by imperial armies, but also historical memory shot by imperial propaganda and imperial narratives. And indeed, this includes removal of any rests of communism from Ukrainian life, because after Second World War, Nazism was condemned, communism not. And the evil, which wasn't condemned, indeed strikes back. We see now this in Ukraine. And third important note is that the recovery of Ukraine is the most complicated and the most large project on the planet during last half a century. Maybe even one is more complicated than that. I mean, a peaceful reconstruction of post-Russian space, which is ahead of us. But the recovery project of Ukraine is enough complicated to gather all the best practices from all over the world. And we have three challenges which are hardly to be reached simultaneously. We have rebuilding, European integration, and modernization. Rebuilding means build back what was destroyed. Modernization means pushing the country up to the next level of development, political, social, economic development. And European integration means to be the true member of the European family. All three things are good, but they remind us of the so-called strategic triangle. Strategic triangle could be illustrated by the popular in business schools idea that our hospital provides you with a cure which is cheap, high quality, and fast. You can choose any two from three, but not three. And rebuilding, European integration, and modernization are in a controversy, and rebuilding demands very fast and cheap solutions. European integration, very right solutions and sustainable solutions, and modernization, very unusual and expensive solutions to bring the country up the next level. So we should install a very complicated mechanism, very complicated tools, including financing, including decision-making, and so on, to be successful in this strategic triangle. Then I would like to remind you the so-called Lugano principles which were signed by several dozens of governments and international organizations this July in Lugano, which define the recovery of Ukraine. There are 7 principles, but I would like to focus on few of them. First is democratic participation, which means that decentralization should be the major idea in making all decisions. Both Ukrainian citizens and European Union politicians confirm that decentralization is the most successful reform in Ukraine for the last 9 years, and the extreme resilience of local communities during Russian invasion and occupation confirm that decentralization was successful. So any solution could not be made without engaging local community, and local community indeed should play the significant role in defining what to do. Then another principle is multi-stakeholderism, which means that private sector, civil society, academia, and other players should also have their voice in open dialogues about the future of any concrete case of rebuilding, not rebuilding, changing the way of usage, and so on. And indeed, other principles are also very important, like inclusivity. Sorry, we shall have a lot of people in Ukraine with some physical damages, to be frank, after the war, and we should build all our premises, make possible usage of them. So, and the major principle indeed is build back better. So not to use temporary solutions like, maybe you know what means Khrushchevka in Ukrainian. Yeah, that means the very cheap building, which was a temporary solution after the Second World War. And this very temporary solution until now defines architectural face of our cities. One of the famous architects of Ukraine, Anna Curie, said, people who got victory never built Khrushchevka. That means that we should avoid any temporary solution which will long last until the end of this century, as all temporary solution. And indeed, cultural heritage is important not only for creative industries, not only for tourism. By the way, Ukraine has a lot of cultural places and places of heritage for Polish, Hungarian, Italian, German, Jewish, Turkish, and other peoples. So I'm sure that we shall have fantastic development of tourism after the victory. But also, cultural heritage means the sense of being for millions of people. And that reminds us the saying of Winston Churchill, which say that we should continue to spend money on culture during the war. Otherwise, we should know what we are fighting for. Sorry for not very, for bad quotation. And I would like to end with a reminder that everything which is not used couldn't be restored, because simply there will be no reason to spend money for those which wouldn't work. So every cultural object which should be restored should find its real usage in real life, maybe as a museum, maybe as a cultural space, maybe as a public space, something like that. And to make everything working, to turn on everything as a live objects, we need indeed voices, open dialogue. We need voices of private sector, of local leaders, of communities, of academia, of civil society organizations. So these are the major principles of Ukrainian recovery, which I would like to share with you. Thank you very much.
We understand that some part of these people, and definitely a huge amount of people from the eastern Ukraine, will stay. They will find the places for living, they will find the jobs, and definitely they will stay maybe in the central Ukraine, maybe in the western Ukraine. Certainly after the war we will have to reconstruct and rebuild our country. And what we see right now we see that a huge amount of heavy industries like steel melted plants and heavy machinery factories, they were destroyed. So, and the question about these factories is not so as about the producers, but let's talk about the future. In the future, we will have the question, should we rebuild these factories? And the question about timing of rebuilding of these factories is very, very crucial, because we understand that, for example, on Azovstal used to work 100,000 of people. And on similar factories, we have the same situation. So after the war, we will have different economical landscape and different population landscape. So we will have some region less inheritable, some more, and a huge amount of migration within the country. And the question of reconstruction will be really interesting. On one hand, in the eastern part of Ukraine, we will have definitely the cultural heritage, and we will have the second question about industrial heritage, about the factories that were destroyed, and what we should do with these factories. In lots of cases, there is no use to rebuild these factories or to renovate these factories, unfortunately. So the question will be how to restore them and what we have to do with them. Maybe make some industrial museums or something like that. On another hand, in the western part of Ukraine and central part of Ukraine, we will have a huge amount of new people. And especially, okay, if you are talking about Lviv, for example, or Kiev, I believe that everything with heritage will be fine. But if we are talking about small cities that really raise the population right now, for example, in the western part of Ukraine, and we can observe it in different cities like Drohobych, like Stry, we will see that the population raised and the businesses are moving into these cities. And we understand that the recovery of Ukraine will be based, and the Ukrainian economical future will be based on the small and medium-sized enterprises, on small businesses. And lots of these businesses will be placed in such small cities with really huge amount of semi-abandoned heritage as of now. So the question will be, how we can assimilate, these people in new places, and what we have to do with this heritage, and maybe it will be the time to give the second life to all these small cities, to reconstruct all these palaces, fortresses, because there are a huge amount of them and really, unfortunately, abandoned. So, as for me, after the war, we will have the question, how we see the Ukraine in 5, in 10 years. And based on this vision, the decision will be taken. And based on the migration processes, the decision should be taken what should be restored in the first line, in the second line, and how we should behave with, as I mentioned, also with our industrial factories from the beginning of the 12th centuries.
Hi, thank you for this invitation. When I think about future, I can't start from thinking, I cannot start, not to start thinking about our past. And during the past 30 years, we've been constantly asking, is it time for Ukrainian culture? And the question that we heard from Ukrainian government that it isn't, that it wasn't the time for Ukrainian culture in 90s when life was complicated and something else was prioritized. It wasn't time for Ukrainian culture after the revolution in 2004. And only after the revolution of dignity, we found that finally some institutions were empowered, some leaders came to this sector, and we started to notice that Ukrainian culture can become visible and can impact local societies and the country itself. But still, it isn't a coincidence that Ukrainian museums were severely regulated for these 30 years, that museum directors were not allowed to take responsibility and to make decisions on their own, if it is exhibitions in the museums or which people they will hire and which positions they will have in the museums. It isn't a coincidence. This regulation creates kind of a paradox. When governments say that culture is not important right now, that it isn't a time for Ukrainian culture right now, and it isn't so important. But still, museum leaders are not allowed taking decisions on their own, and they are watched by government on every step. And this lack of trust was created this series of problems that we saw how they impacted the situation after February 24th. When directors could not take decision about evacuation, directors could not take decisions on their own to prevent losses that we had. Directors were left with, were very much understaffed, and after February 24th, the salaries of museum workers were cut severely. So again, it isn't, while we are fighting in different directions, including culture, trying to fight back for our heritage, which was in a big part appropriated by Russia, stolen by Russia, relocated by Russia. And yet, we don't have enough financial possibilities from the government, which is okay during the war. But at the same time, museums are not a subject of action and are not allowed in a legal way to find other solutions, how to operate during the war and how to impact local societies during the war. And we see this lack of capability. At the same time, we see wonderful examples of museum teams that took extra leadership by protecting not only their museums, their collections, but also stepping up to protect other Ukrainian museums to help colleagues. And this fascinates me, and I'm so proud. And at the same time, it's one of the crucial things that motivates me every day, that we have so many real leaders who take responsibility, no matter how hard it is. And yet we see some museums where this crisis of management is very obvious right now. And it is also a result of 30 years. It's not a time for Ukrainian culture. So in the future, I think that we should always start with the point that now it is time for Ukrainian culture, and that should be a common vision on every scale of our society. It should be a vision of our government. It should be a vision of politicians. It should be a vision of people, that culture is crucial, is very important. Museums are powerful, can be powerful subjects of change in the society. And decolonization, and as Valery Becker mentioned, is the process where museums can be the perfect tool to go through this with our societies without leaving anyone behind. So for that, we will need the most trust there can be from the side of Ukrainian government and from the side of Ukrainian societies. We will need deregulation of museums, and we will need to give the museums opportunity to act fast and take responsibility, carry this responsibility, but be able to take decision for the museum's action. And academia is also a crucial part for this future rebuilding, for future operation of museums. We will need hundreds and hundreds of specialists. And yet for now, we risk of many Ukrainian specialists are now abroad. And there is the risk someone will go back. And our cultural community, our country has to be appealing to our people to return, and we will need more specialists who maybe we could train before the Victory Day will arrive, because without specialists, it will be very hard for museums to rebuild and to be effective. So summing up, I think that Ukrainian museums already have all of this potential. We can already see how it works. We can see it in the amounts of collections that have been saved because of the people who are working in museums. We see all of these digitalization projects that are happening all over the Ukraine. And it is happening also because of the capability of certain museum leaders who are working right now. We have all of these potentials. I feel that Ukrainian museums will be a very, very important part of rebuilding, and we will need all of the support there can be for that. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I'm here. I hope you can hear me all well without echo. I hear echo now, actually. I can also hear the echo in Zoom, yeah. Now it's better. No, I can still hear it.
Sound technician today got really bad problem.
Okay, I try nevertheless, and hope you can still follow. Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation and for the introduction and for the speakers before me. A lot of things that were mentioned as principles, as challenges, as ideas were very much resonating with me already. I think are very much happening in the context of the work we also do. I maybe start a little bit in terms of like where we came from and what's the background of our work in Ukraine, not only this year, but also more than 15 years, I think almost 20 years that we have been engaged with especially civil society actors and new initiatives in the field of culture. So the European Cultural Foundation is an independent foundation, lottery financed. So we are not the European Union, maybe that at the very beginning. So the big renovation, reconstruction budgets will have to come from somewhere else. But as was mentioned in the introduction, we finance a lot of small processes, research, new cultural initiatives, locally rooted initiatives that think about the future. And we have been doing that actually for long years in Ukraine. We started out, and I think it's very appropriate to the topic we discuss today. One of our first initiatives was that we supported groups in creating what was called alternative art maps, looking into the heritage, the resources, the possibilities of different cities. I think 10 cities all over Ukraine. I remember Kherson was part of it, Luhansk, Donetsk, Odessa, Lviv, Kyiv. So this was one of the first initiatives we did. I mention it here also because some of you mentioned already that participation in cultural decision making and strategizing on local level and institutional level will be very crucial. And that was also in these processes that grew out of these alternative art maps and art guides for these cities, very crucial point of development where local initiative groups then were lobbying to become involved in decision making and planning cultural development on local level and municipal level, discussing with the mayors, discussing with all stakeholders in town. I mentioned already as a relatively small foundation that gives small scale support. Our field of work was mostly civil society, but always also civil society initiatives that involved larger public institutions, such as museums, and everyone working locally. A second background of our work has been for many years as part of our mission as European Cultural Foundation, exchange and collaboration between Ukrainian cultural actors and artists and their peers and colleagues and professionals and institutions all over Europe. So in the neighborhood of Ukraine, but also all over the European Union. Our tandem programs for many years brought together small and larger cultural initiatives and managers of those with peers all over Europe. Which was already back then part of integrating Ukraine's cultural sector into overall European collaboration channels, networks, systems. And now, more recently, since February, our very crucial and focused work also for us with the Culture of Solidarity Fund. Culture of Solidarity Fund was initially started as a fund for answering cultural emergencies and disconnecting or the blocked kind of like collaboration channels in the course of the pandemic, and over the years developed into a major European solidarity tool, which obviously then immediately could jump into action. And the second day of the war already started to make first donations and grants for emergency situations, in this case, evacuating smaller art studios and museum evacuation projects and initiatives on smaller scale all over the country, which was part of it. We have meanwhile made more than 100 projects, supported more than 100 projects, and it still continues with 15 to 20 partners and co-financing partners from all over Europe. And we are now also for the future exactly thinking about the topic of this conference and gathering. So what can we do next, what will we do next with our partners. And I would also like to share 3 major principles which seem to be important for us and for me when considering what to do next in the context of rebuilding Ukraine's recovery, cultural recovery. So the first point I wanted to make is, and it was already mentioned by speakers before, to very strongly work on cultural civil society initiatives, on participation, on integration of all different stakeholders in planning, imagining, and envisioning and strategizing for the future, so that culture does not remain a domain of the institutions and of political decision makers, but is really the whole Ukraine recovery is a bottom-up initiative, a movement, I hope, that evolves from this terrible situation. That basically the whole country, all citizens, everyone living in Ukraine becomes part of a movement to rebuild, because I believe it's not only about recovering and rebuilding constructions and institutions that are there, but I think the whole fabric of cultural sector and cultural civil society will need recovery, will need rebuilding, and will need a new spirit of envisioning the future of Ukraine, the cultural future of Ukraine, which brings me to my, or maybe one point about the function of museums and infrastructure in this. We also have a program working with libraries all over Ukraine, and I believe the function of buildings, of reconstructed buildings in the future will also be to provide meeting places, safe spaces for citizens, cultural stakeholders, decision makers, investors, everyone to meet and to discuss what the future could be. So I really imagine also a future of institutions that are not only preserving collections and showing collections, but also become really meeting places where the recovery and the future, the cultural future of Ukraine can be imagined jointly. The second point, and a future that refers to my second point to be imagined, because I think what will be very, very central is, and some previous speakers already mentioned it as well, is to think about Ukraine's cultural sector and the recovery of it in the context of the starting EU integration process, so that right from the beginning, the recovery process is done in collaboration with colleagues and peers from all over Europe, that learning, exchange, and learning from each other, developing new visions happens with a very clearly European imagination, pan-European dimension in mind, which also refers to standards, new standards that are already existing elsewhere in Europe, partially for sure also in Ukraine already, to introduce and to rebuild and work on the recovery of Ukraine immediately with a all open European lens as a future EU member state, and the cultural sector that will operate and work in a future EU member state in mind. Which brings me finally to the third point, which is also connected to European principles, standards to consider. There's a very interesting exploratory process still on EU level called the New European Bauhaus, which basically is about introducing a new school of thought and design for ecological aware and sustainable future of building and of, in the case of Ukraine, also reconstructing all over Europe, or especially in Ukraine. And I really believe that these principles of the New European Bauhaus could be a real inspiration or a framework for thinking about how buildings, how new buildings maybe also can be built in the context of a post-war situation in Ukraine. And I really believe that Ukraine's cultural sector and the reconstruction process could really be a thought leader and a very unique a test ground of experimental ideas and forward-looking inspiration on how new cultural infrastructure can be built and filled with life in interaction with citizens, or even in co-decision by all stakeholders in a very specific situation, and with peers from all over Europe. Well, we will continue with the Culture of Solidarity Fund to support exactly such initiatives as this gathering organized today. But more initiatives, we will, especially in the future, also next year and the year after, support initiatives and projects that look forward into the future and pick up exactly on what you started discussing here. And we look forward to bring together Ukrainian initiatives, everyone working in and for and in solidarity with Ukraine and Europeans together for envisioning and imagining a European future for Ukraine. Thank you.
I want to invite people who will talk on behalf of Sara Abram from La Veneria Reale. It's Chiara Ricci and Federico Diorio, and I want to ask them to switch on the Zoom and mic.
So, okay, I will continue trying to share the screen so we can show you some pictures. Okay. Okay, so just to give you some hints, the Center for Conservation and Restoration La Venaria Reale is located near the city of Turin in the northwest of Italy. The center is a no-profit foundation established in 2005 as part of the broader restoration works of an historical building, the Reggio di Venaria Reale Palace, and it is located in the former 18th century stable. It hosts also a master degree course in conservation offered by the University of Turin. The center includes several departments, including 9 different conservation laboratories, the scientific laboratories, the advanced training and study school, and the education services. Therefore, many are the artworks and materials to be faced in conservation activities, paintings on canvas and on panels, wooden furniture and artifacts, stone, wall paintings, contemporary art, textiles, paper, metals, ceramic and glass artifacts, and even human remains. Considering the broad range of topics and materials that we face every day, multidisciplinarity is of course the key, and that's why our work teams always involve different professionals such as conservators, scientists, photographers, art historians, archaeologists, and so on.
The scientific laboratories daily work side by side with the conservators, supporting all conservation activities with photographic and multispectral imaging documentation, non-invasive and micro-invasive analytical techniques. More specifically, the analysis performed by the scientific laboratories support all aspects of the conservation activities, the study of the original materials and technique, the condition assessment and the investigation of the deterioration phenomena, the testing and monitoring of conservation treatments of products, as well as the documentation, dissemination, and training. The photographic and multispectral imaging laboratory carries out 2- and 3-dimensional documentation of artifacts and external sites at every stage of the conservation process, namely before, during, and after it, providing conservators, conservation scientists, and art historians with essential information for a more complete understanding of the work and a clearer perspective on the advancement of the intervention. The photographic techniques aim to document the state of preservation of each object and are based on the basic principles of archaeological photography, such as correct representation of shapes, measurement accuracy, and uniformity of illumination. The term multispectral imaging refers to a set of non-invasive analyses that allow the reproduction of the artwork using different electromagnetic bands other than the visible one. Thanks to appropriate changes, the sensor of normal cameras is then able to record information from a range of wavelengths much wider than the visible one, including also the ultraviolet and infrared regions. Therefore, in addition to the more traditional photos collected with the diffuse and raking visible light, the laboratory can provide ultraviolet and infrared images. One of the most used non-invasive techniques is in the conservation field is ultraviolet fluorescence photography. It permits to easily distinguish repaintings from the original painting. Indeed, overlaid and more recent materials look darker when illuminated with ultraviolet light. This examination can also highlight the possible presence of varnish or protective materials on the surface of an artwork. Visible photography represents the most important part in the process of documenting an artifact. It allows to record the current state of preservation and helps to show the surface appearance visible to the naked eye, as well as being an important evidence in case of a conservation intervention. The image of an artwork obtained by means of infrared reflectography may appear significantly different from how it appears to the naked eye. In fact, some pigment layers opaque to visible light may be partially transparent to the infrared radiation, highlighting underdrawings, pentimenti, or lacunas. Moreover, this technique can make difficult to read areas of the painting more readable and suggest a discrimination of pigments that may appear similar but present a different absorption of the infrared radiation. This technique is preparatory to false color, an image that combines visible and infrared data to generate a third result in post-production. With infrared false color photography, is it possible to make an initial hypothesis about the original pigments used by the artist and those possibly added later on occasion of conservation intervention? False color can in fact provide useful information on the identity of a pigment through comparison with databases. It is, however, risky to draw conclusions based solely on the observation of the infrared color result, since pigments were often used mixed or overlaid in several layers. The visible induced luminescence is an infrared analysis. The physical principle of the technique is the same that occurs for ultraviolet fluorescence, but in this case, the emission happens in the near infrared region. The luminescence is centered around 910 nanometers, and it is an effective method to characterize Egyptian blue, Han blue, and Han purple on different types of surfaces. SWIR stands for shortwave infrared. It indicates the infrared region closest to the visible spectrum, but unlike the infrared reflectography, the sensor of these special instruments can record information down to 1700 nanometers. This technique, as the previous one, allows to examine the preparation layer below the pigment layer, supporting conservators in the reading of the underdrawing. The three-dimensional representation generated by photographs, especially when measurable, facilitate the spatial interpretation of an object, allowing the viewer to perceive its true shape. The integration of multispectral data from the previous techniques multiplies the possibility of understanding an artifacts.
Other techniques for bidimensional and three-dimensional documentation respectively consist in digital radiography and computed tomography. The center is provided with a system to perform X-ray imaging on large objects. These imaging techniques allow to investigate the spatial distribution of the materials composing the artwork and to see the inner structure and assembly of all parts in three-dimensional objects. Still speaking of non-invasive analysis, different portable instruments are available at the center to perform spectroscopy techniques, also on site, like X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, Raman spectroscopy, and fiber optics reflectance spectroscopy. They can all be of great help for the characterization of either original and non-original materials, such as supports, inorganic pigments, or dyes, just to cite a few. When preliminary non-invasive techniques are not sufficient to reply to all questions from conservators, we apply then microinvasive diagnostic techniques, namely those which require a sampling from the artwork. An example is given by the infrared spectroscopy, which can be used to identify both organic and inorganic compounds, whether they are constitutive materials or degradation products. After sampling and preparation of cross-section, it is also possible to investigate the artwork stratigraphy by means of microscopy techniques. Samples can be observed through optical and scanning electron microscope, and the same techniques find many other applications, ranging from the identification of natural fibers to the monitoring of conservation treatments. Microscopy is also one of the most used techniques for biological analysis, which are performed to identify microorganisms or other biological agents of deterioration. Nonetheless, the activities carried out by the scientific laboratories are not limited to diagnostic, but also focus on research and tests on mock-ups, aiming to develop innovative methodologies, verify the effectiveness of new products, monitoring the conservation treatments applied over the time, and create databases of reference materials. And finally, the scientific team of the center also contributed to the development and realization of national and international training programs, workshops, and webinars addressed to conservation students and professionals. Thanks.